There's this meme that's going around. It's a picture of describing a meme is often almost impossible, but it's a picture of this person who looks pretty frazzled. It looks like they've been through a war. And they just say, man, it has been such a hard year. And then the camera pans to somebody else, and that person says, bro, it's only the second week of January. And that's to say it feels like it's been almost a whole year's worth of hard things. And we're really just now on the second day of February of 2025. How do we deal with hard things? This week's been a week of hard things. It started pretty much right after worship service last week with word that Pastor Joe's sister had been rushed to the hospital. And that afternoon she passed away. At the same time, we received word that Seneca, our Scranton Road Ministries after-school enrichment program director, had died suddenly and tragically. And then the rest of the week was feeling the grief, the deep grief and sorrow and anguish that comes on a community when something like that happens. How do we deal with hard things? I think about it a lot. I've thought about it a lot over the years. Sometimes through personal tragedy, sometimes sharing the tragedy that other people have experienced. I've revisited it this week just in light of our text this morning. I've seen a lot of death. Some were good friends taken too early, and some I've barely known. Murders, suicides, medical problems, cancer, heart attacks, strokes, freak accidents. I've seen people suffering. Domestic violence, bullying, medical problems, natural disasters, persecution, unlawful arrests. Many people, when faced with these kinds of things, reject God. It's hard to keep walking in faith when things feel like they're falling apart. It's hard to keep walking with God when it seems like God may not be in as much control as you've thought. I've heard those questions a lot this week. Where's God in all this? You may feel that way too. You may be here this morning and you may have that question burning deep inside of you. Where is God in all this hardship and pain and sorrow? I'm glad that you're here if you are struggling with that question. It may be the single best thing you've been able to do this week. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in this sermon. It's really easy to believe in God when nothing bad ever happens, when everything is going great, when you don't face hardship. And believe it or not, there are people who very rarely face hardship. But they're a minority. And the majority of us, we face hard things. We face the question of what to do when bad things happen over and over, grinding and grinding. And it can wear us down, and it can spark doubts and even disbelief. What can we do about it? What's the answer? As a pastor, I worry when bad things happen that people within the church will just jettison their faith. It keeps me up at night. That you'll get tired of trying. That'll just be too much, too heavy of a burden. If that's you right now, then today's text can help. It won't answer all your questions why. It won't make you feel good immediately, probably. But there are things that we can see that Paul writes that can help us, that can help us navigate the depths of darkness. because Paul has that same worry for the Thessalonians. He has that same kind of worry for the people who live in Thessalonica. They are suffering. And not just suffering just in general, they're suffering for their faith. And the easiest thing for them to do at this point is to just kick it to the curb, to jettison it, to not have to face the problems that they face because of the things they say that they believe. To just drop it and walk away, and everything would be better. Paul worries that the struggles that the people are facing will have shaken them so much that it was shaken them free from this baby faith that they have and that seems to have been growing. He says that he's worried that the trials that they faced would unsettle them and that the tempter would tempt them. And then their faith would just shrink to nothing. That's his fear. And his primary response is to want to go to them. But as we've seen in past texts, he can't. He's been stopped. And so he does the next best thing. He sends Timothy. He sends Timothy with three purposes that we see in our text, to do three things related to his worry about this hard time that this young church is going through. He sends Timothy to strengthen them and encourage them in verse 2. And then to find out about their faith in verse 5. And these three things, these three things that Paul sends Timothy to do, they point us to how we can navigate the dark and hard times that we can go through. Now I want to start with that third thing. It maybe is the biggest piece of these three. Naturally, Paul wants to find out about their faith. He's been away from them. If you remember, he'd come to their city, just as a recap. He had shared the gospel with them. He had taught them for a few weeks. Maybe as many as 6, no fewer than 3. But then he had been chased out. And then they faced the stuff that Paul kind of ran from in the navigation of their new faith. And so he's curious to know how their faith has been holding up in the face of this. Now, Paul doesn't send Timothy to spy on the people, to question the purity of their doctrine so that he can say, aha, I got you. He's not sending Timothy to kind of lurk outside the windows and write the notes on how faithful everyone has been. He wants to know what's going on. And so he's sending Timothy on a fact-finding mission. You remember the parable that Jesus taught in Matthew chapter 13, the parable of the sower? Jesus taught this parable to his disciples. He said, then he told them many things in parables, saying that a farmer went out to sow his seed. As he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path, and the birds came and ate it up. Some fell on rocky places where it did not have much soil. It sprang up quickly because the soil was shallow. But when the sun came up, the plants were scorched and they withered because they had no root. Other seed fell among thorns, which grew up and choked the plants. Still other seed fell on good soil where it produced a crop 160 or 30 times what was sown. He who has ears, let him hear. Then Jesus' disciples are like, what are you talking about, Jesus? Like, what's this mean? Why are you telling these parables? And Jesus later explains this parable's meaning to his disciples. He says, listen then to what the parable of the sower means. When anyone hears the message about the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what was sown in his heart. This is the seed sown along the path. The one who received the seed that fell in the rocky places is the one who hears the word and at once receives it with joy, but since they have no root, they last only a short time. When trouble or persecution comes because of the word, they quickly fall away. The one who received the seed that fell among the thorns is the one who hears the word, but the worries of this life and the deceitfulness of wealth choke it, making it unfruitful. But the one who received the seed that fell on good soil is the one who hears the word and understands it. They produce a crop yielding 100, 60, or 30 times what was sown. Paul's seen where they are. What kind of seed and soil? And he wants to know so that he can help them. What kind of seed? What kind of soil? Probably not the first one, because the words seem to have taken root. But will he find that the troubles and the persecutions choked out? Timothy came to check and find out about their faith. Paul's fears are that they've been rattled and that the tempter has tempted them away. He's afraid that these Thessalonians, in the face of hard things, have lost the stability of their faith. That newfound shine and polish. That gleam of something new and novel. Has their faith grown as they come to grips with certain truths? Or have they left it behind? It's like that new job. You know, when you first get a job, especially if your last job was really horrible, you're excited to be there, and everything is going really good at first. Your coworkers seem to care about you, and they want you to learn the ropes, and your boss is pretty cool, and the job itself is exciting, and you have all these new ideas, and things are going great for a little bit. And then there's that point where you go in one day, and you're like, man, I don't really like being here. And it's like you've gotten past what they call the honeymoon phase. When the realities of the job actually set in and you actually start seeing everything for what it is and the truth of it all comes crashing in, and you lose a little bit of the joy. Paul's worried. He's worried that these Thessalonians have faced the reality of the world they live in, and they no longer want to walk in the faith they've found. But Paul discovers that they haven't. We'll look at that next week, but Paul sees that their faith remains strong. But he does discover some interesting things. They have weathered the storm of persecution, of suffering, but they're asking questions. When Paul sends Timothy to check on them, Timothy then has to come back to Paul and report, and then Paul writes the letter that we're reading today. It is a response to what Timothy found in Thessalonica. And so some of the things that Paul talks about in this letters are responses to the questions or the concerns that the people had. The first one is, really, do we really have to suffer? And Paul reminds them in verse 4, in fact, when we were with you, we kept telling you that you would be persecuted. And it's turned out that way. He just reminds them, I told you that this was going to happen. That this is the lot that you have chosen. There's an expectation that you're going to face hardships outside of the normal run of life. Jesus told his disciples that very thing in Matthew 10. Be on your guard. You will be handed over to the local councils and be flogged in the synagogues. On my account, you will be brought before governors and kings as witnesses to them and to the Gentiles. But when they arrest you, not if, when they arrest you. Do not worry about what to say or how to say it. At that time you will be given what to say. For it will not be you speaking, but the Spirit of your Father speaking through you. Brother will betray brother to death, and a father his child. Children will rebel against their parents and have them put to death. You will be hated by everyone because of me. But the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. Peter reminds us of that too in 1 Peter. Dear friends, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal that has come on you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you. But rejoice inasmuch as you participate in the sufferings of Christ, so that you may be overjoyed when his glory is revealed. The theme and expectation, the lot of the Christian life is that we will face hardship and suffering, which is counter to what we expect nowadays. It's counter to what most of us work towards. Every conversation about what you send, the reason for why you send your kids to school, is counter that. Think about those conversations you have. I don't want to go to school. Well, you have to go to school. Why do I have to go to school? So you can learn. Who cares about learning? Why do I have to learn? You have to learn so you can go to a good college. Why do I have to go to a good college? So you can get a good job. Why do I have to get a good job? So you can pay your bills and live comfortably and successfully in life. Right? Every conversation is that trajectory. Comfort, success. We want ease and comfort. And when those things aren't readily available, we feel like our world has been rocked. The theme, the expectation of the Christian life is that we will face hardship and suffering. That seems, the best I can tell, to be the expected norm for a Christian life. My missions professor in seminary spent almost 2 decades on the field in Papua New Guinea. And he said one of the biggest things they had to fight against was a thing, it was kind of cultish, but it was a thing called container Christianity. And basically it was this thing where a person would come into a village and he would say, or he or she would say, hey, I've received a word from God that there is a shipping container at the nearest port that has been sent to us from God in my name, and that in this container is all the things that we need to make life good, whether it's wealth or whatever is needed. And that God has told me that this thing is there and that he's going to bless us with this thing if you follow God, but really the person would be saying, follow me. And then people would get excited about that, and they would follow this prophet, and the prophet would take them to the port, and of course there was no container, and the people their faith would just be shattered and they would leave. Our faith is built on hope of something. But it's a hope that's bigger than anything in this life. It's a hope that's bigger than a good career or a shipping container full of good things. It isn't about what we get, although we are promised some amazing things. In fact, the promise that we receive, I think, is beyond our ability to grasp. But we aren't called to believe and follow because we're going to get this great stuff. We're called to follow because it's true. It's not because it makes our life easier or practically speaking, it's logical. It's none of that thing. It's not pragmatic, I guess is the word I'm trying to look for. It's true. And truth can take us in really hard places to walk. I don't tell people to not jump off of the tops of buildings because they'll be blessed if they don't. Even though they will, they'll be blessed by not having broken legs or whatever. I tell people not to do that because it reflects the reality of gravity. I care about your faith not for the great stuff that comes at the other end. It does. There is really great stuff. I care because it's true. It reflects reality. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says that if Christ hasn't been resurrected, then we are to be pitied more than anyone else because we live a lie. And he wants us to understand the truth of our faith. To believe in God and what he has done through Jesus Christ is to believe what is true, the most true about the world. There are some other questions that come up in this community in Thessalonica. Most scholars point to really two big questions after the question of suffering. The first is that there were people who were saying that Paul was a con man, that he was just making stuff up to get money and to get prestige. And Paul deals with that in other places in this letter. And he really just deals with it by saying, don't you remember how I lived among you? How can you say that these people are true? It's just reminding them of the truths. And another pressing question is, we get the suffering, but what happens to me or my family if we die before Jesus returns? That's why we get such a big section later on in chapters 4 and 5 of 1 Thessalonians that deals with end time stuff and Jesus' return. Because people had those questions. What happens? What happens? And Paul is able to assess these things, what's going on, the questions that people have, because those people have been honest with Timothy, and they've passed those questions on to Timothy. They haven't held them inside and clung to them as these secrets that they're not supposed to ask. We don't ask questions because we're afraid of a couple things. We're afraid of looking stupid, foolish. We maybe think we should know the answer to that question and we don't, so we don't. Like all these things that come up. But these people, it seems, were real open with where they were. And so now Paul can deal with those in a letter that's helpful. They're asking somebody they can trust. The internet is one of the greatest things that has happened in my lifetime. It is amazing that I can go from not knowing anything about the red-shanked duke, which is a type of monkey, to having almost all the information in the world about it at my fingertips. The internet's great for questions like that, but certain questions are harder to find the good answers to. And if we aren't careful, we find ourselves turning to some crazy things. When we go through hard things, it's natural for us to have questions. Very rarely do I get to interact with someone on the front end of those hard questions. It's usually after someone has a question or a doubt, and they've sat on that question or doubt for a long time, and they've done all the work on their own to figure it out, often through the internet. Sometimes they've interacted with good resources, maybe people or things that I would have pointed them to, but other times they've interacted with poor resources. Often those resources haven't included the Bible, or they've included people who've just written about the Bible or talked about the Bible. But they haven't asked the questions within the community that we're in, the church. We don't ask questions for a whole bunch of reasons. We're afraid we'll rock the boat, or we're afraid that somebody will think that we lost our faith, or they'll question our doubt. But the problem when that happens is the darkness grows, and you don't stop thinking just because you're not asking the questions. And it grows, and then the questions overwhelm, and especially when multiple bad things and hard things are happening, our faith takes hits after hit. And if you're processing that internally by yourself, then those hits just chip away and chip away and chip away. If the Thessalonians had just let the detractors shake their faith in who Paul was, and just kind of held it in and just, maybe they would have entertained that he was a con man, but never really brought that up, then that would have just eroded their faith in what he had said. Or if they sat there with those questions about what happens to their loved ones, they may have decided that this new faith, this Christian faith, was nice and seemed okay, but wasn't worth what they had to give up to pursue it. But they were honest with Timothy and to Paul. So Paul sent to find out about their faith, but he also sent Timothy to strengthen and to encourage them as well. The word we translate as strengthen literally means to establish firmly, to cause someone to become stronger in attitude or belief. And the second word, encourage, literally means to come alongside of and support. And the purpose of these two things, Paul says in verse 3, is so that no one would be unsettled by these trials. Establish firmly. Help them become stronger in their attitude and belief and support them. It's real easy to forget that we will face trials. If we weren't Christians, just regular people going about our life, we would face hard times. Everybody does. We would face job layoffs, deaths, broken relationships. We would face all the things that we still face. That's just the normal wear and tear of life. Everyone faces those things. But then you add the layer of faith, and we see something a little different. We have the potential to face persecution, someone treating us poorly just because of what we believe. Could be based upon their hatred of things that we believe in, or their own deconstructed faith, or even just their own wrong understanding of what we believe. But underneath it all is something that we have to acknowledge if we have any hope to find strength and encouragement. Paul makes it pretty clear when he writes in verse 5, I was afraid the tempter had tempted. Underneath all of this is our fight against the true enemy. Peter says in all that Satan's desires that we would collapse. He says that Satan prowls like a lion seeking who he can devour, who he can destroy. Paul writes that we fight against powers and principalities. In Daniel, we see a little bit of that warfare being played out as Daniel had prayed and fasted. Daniel chapter 10. There's this whole level of warfare happening underneath the surface. And if we forget that, then we leave a whole lot unaccounted for. And it seems to me that Satan will use the least amount of energy required to cripple us all. Remember the parable of the sower? Snatch the word away first, then suffering. The normal everyday things that we face, if they can create doubt, great. The enemy is won. The comforts of life, great. The enemy has won. Look at Jesus' life. One of the first obstacles that Jesus faced, it wasn't the religious officials hating him or people trying to kill him or hardships. Jesus was baptized, and then he was led out into the wilderness where Satan, the tempter, sought to tempt him away from what he was called to do. He was given promises of the good stuff before there was ever pain and suffering. Oh, you're hungry? Eat this. Oh, you're afraid to be hurt? I can make it so you're never hurt. You're going to die? I can give you so much power that you never have to worry about dying. We are so wooed by comfort and ease that the hard things of life shake our faith. And so often the first response is we just step out of Christian community, we just give it up. And the tempter, Satan, laughs because he wins. Paul's strategy for helping the Thessalonians isn't to remove them from their suffering or to send money for their legal defense team. It was to send Timothy to strengthen and encourage. It is to remind them of the truths that he taught, to say, I know, it is hard. It isn't easy, but keep on. And this doesn't happen at a distance. Paul didn't stop at the letter. He really wanted to be there, but he sent Timothy. It happens together as we're doing the things that we do when we gather together. Sometimes irritating each other, but often encouraging and praying and helping and all the millions of little small things that happen when we're together. When we gather together, we practice what Paul's doing here. We encourage and we strengthen. When we are open about our struggles, we give each other the chance to strengthen and encourage us. If you walk up to somebody and say, I'm struggling today, hopefully they'll at least offer to pray, but hopefully that opens up a whole nother conversation. Sometimes it's as simple as a phone call or a visit or a meal cooked. It could be prayer or listening ear. And it almost certainly is pointing each other to Christ. In Hebrews 10, the writer says to focus on Jesus, the one who's changed our lives and brings hope, and with him the center of all of our focus. And then he goes on to write in verses 23 through 25, let us hold unswervingly to the hope we profess. For he who promised is faithful. And let us consider how we may spur one another on toward love and good deeds, not giving up meeting together, as some are in the habit of doing, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching. Keep meeting together and keep looking at Jesus. Keep remembering that God will be faithful and true. It isn't some empty pep talk, but it's pointing us to the one, Jesus, considering Jesus, the one who endured pain and suffering and sorrow from sinners, so that we won't lose heart. We won't grow weary. It's so easy to forget. It's so easy to lose sight of those truths. Jesus stepped out of the comfort that was his by right and into the pain and suffering of what it means to redeem his creation. Jesus didn't sit on his throne and write us a letter or send us a text. He stepped into this world so that we could have hope. He embraced suffering because that is what sin brings. And that was the cost of saving us. When we forget that our Lord calls us to that same kind of life. We get complacent, and the smallest little thing can shake us. But when we gather and remember what Jesus has done, that can help us to refocus and rethink our own lives. Let's pray. Lord, help us to endure it in hard times. Help our faith to be strong to make it through just the normal wear and tear of life. Help us to face the hard things that comes our way. Lord, I pray that we would stay focused on you, that we would cling to you and the truth of who you are and what you've done in this world, that we would remember that you suffered for us, and that would set the tone for all of our life. That one, we would be willing to step out of our comfort into the potential for suffering in a world that looks to you last. Help us to not be so caught up in our own comfort that we forget what you've called us to do as your people. I pray this for myself, Lord. Help us to resist the temptation to shy away from the truth of who you are and what you've done, just to make things easier on ourselves. Help us to embrace suffering, not for suffering's sake, but for your sake, in this mission that you've given us in this world. Lord, we pray for comfort, pray for encouragement and strength. Help us to be real with each other when we struggle. Help us to all to be these Timothys that are checking in on each other's faith, and not because we're nosy or keeping count, but because we want to love each other well. Lord, I pray that you would just bless us and go with us today as we leave here. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
This is communion.